Why is it that the United States is willing to risk and trifle with these incredibly grave dangers with the world's largest nuclear stockpile? We're getting closer and closer to direct military confrontation. You now have Ukrainian soldiers with highly offensive weapons, highly sophisticated weapons, enabled by the United States, supplied by the United States, going into Russia and bombing and killing Russians inside Russia. And they're now going to have F-16 sent and delivered by the Biden administration after a series of bizarre reversals that shows how unhinged this war policy is. And what is particularly bizarre about this, and I want to talk to Sagar about this when he comes on, because I genuinely think it's mystifying in a way, is that for at least a decade in Washington, bipartisan Washington, the view of the bipartisan class in Washington and the foreign policy community was that there is no vital interest for the United States in Ukraine. This doctrine of vital interest is crucial. It says, where are we willing to go to war? For what are we willing to go to war? Which countries are vital enough to our interests to risk justifying military confrontation? And there's nothing in Ukraine that has ever been considered a vital interest to the United States, to the point where in April of 2016, that very same Jeffrey Goldberg, who rose to become the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic after getting caught telling multiple lies while at The New Yorker, he was one of President Obama's favorite journalists, this neocon. And Obama sat down with him to discuss what Jeffrey Goldberg titled in this article, The Obama Doctrine. The U.S. president talks through his hardest decisions about America's role in the world. And one of the things Jeffrey Goldberg badgered him about was Obama's refusal to do more for Ukraine, to arm Ukraine, to do more to punish the Russians for taking Crimea. And Jeffrey Goldberg kept saying, why didn't you do more to protect Ukraine? Why didn't you do more to arm Ukraine, to use Ukraine to hurt Russia? And here's what Obama said, quote, Obama's theory here is simple. Ukraine is a core Russian interest, but not an American one. So Russia will always be able to maintain escalatory dominance there. Quote, the fact is that Ukraine, which is a non-NATO country, is going to be vulnerable to military domination by Russia no matter what we do, Obama said. I asked Obama whether his position on Ukraine was realistic or fatalistic. Quote, it's realistic. But this is an example of where we have to be very clear about what our core interests are and what we are willing to go to war for. And at the end of the day, there's always going to be some ambiguity. He then offered up a critique he had heard directed against him in order to knock it down. Quote, I think the best argument you can make on the side of those who are my critics of my foreign policy is that the president doesn't exploit ambiguity enough. He doesn't maybe react in ways that might cause people to think, wow, this guy might be a little crazy, which is what Donald Trump said he liked about having John Bolton at his side. Quote, there is no evidence in modern American foreign policy at Obama that that's how people respond. People respond based on what their imperatives are. And if it's really important to somebody and it's not that important to us, they know that and we know that. There are ways to deter, but it requires you to be very clear ahead of time about what is worth going to war for and what is not. Now, if there is somebody in this town that would claim that we should consider going to war with Russia over Crimea and eastern Ukraine, and Obama describes it that way because it's facially absurd that we would consider going to war with Russia over Crimea and eastern Ukraine. Obama said they should speak up and be very clear about it. He wanted them to say that. These militarists in the Republican Party like John McCain and Lindsey Graham and Marco Rubio, who were attacking him for not doing more to confront Russia, he said, stand up and say, if you believe it, that we should risk war with Russia over Ukraine. Quote, the idea that talking tough or engaging in some military action that is tangential to that particular area is somehow going to influence the decision-making of Russia or China is contrary to all the evidence we have seen over the last 50 years. In other words, it's so absurd that we would go to war or risk war with Russia over who rules eastern Ukraine that Obama was daring his critics to stand up and say it because, of course, they didn't want to say, I'm willing to risk war with Russia over Ukraine. And yet that's exactly what U.S. policy has become. We are risking war with Russia, undoubtedly, indisputably, over nothing more than the question of who rules various provinces in eastern Ukraine. The reason Obama didn't go to war with Russia or didn't really take strong action against Russia when it annexed Crimea was because he knew that the people of Crimea wanted to be under Russian rule, wanted to be under Moscow rule. just like the people of Kosovo wanted independence from Serbia. And the precedent we set was if the people of this province want independence enough, they should have it. That's why Kosovo is now an independent country. And it's indisputably true that Crimea and the people in it consider themselves far more Russian than Ukrainian. It's long been true as well of the people of Eastern Ukraine. And so why would we possibly continue to trifle with war with a nuclear armed power over any of this? Now, it wasn't just Barack Obama who thought this. There was a president after him named Donald Trump who thought the same thing. In fact, when Trump saw the Republican Party's platform when it came to Ukraine, that seemed like it was written by neocons and John McCain and Marco Rubio and that crowd, Lindsey Graham, basically saying, we will always arm Ukraine, we will stand by Ukraine. Trump thought that was insane. Just like Trump thought it was insane that the U.S. was trying to overthrow Bashar al-Assad in Syria and risk confrontation there through the CIA. And Trump's position was, why would we try and change the government of Syria? We should cooperate with Russia and Syria to kill ISIS and al-Qaeda. Why would we want to change the government of Syria? He thought the same thing about Ukraine. He expressed it in Trumpian ways, but it was the same position Obama had, which was risking war with Russia or harming the United States to protect Ukraine from Russia is insanity. And so he had the GOP platform changed, and amazingly, and this is when I really began realizing how insane the establishment become when it came to Russiagate, they used the change in that platform, which just reflected Trump's view of pragmatism and the desire to avoid wars that weren't a direct threat to the United States, to claim that this was proof somehow that Trump was in the Kremlin's pocket. That he took the same position Obama did, which is there's nothing in Ukraine worth going to war with Russia over. From the Washington Post, July 18, 2016. Quote, there you see the headline, Trump campaign guts GOP's anti-Russia stance on Ukraine. Quote, the Trump campaign worked behind the scenes last week to make sure the new Republican platform won't call for giving weapons to Russia to fight Russian and rebel forces, contradicting the view of almost all Republican foreign policy leaders in Washington. Oh, perish the thought. Republican foreign policy leaders in Washington have been so correct about everything, you would never want to contradict them. This was a major prong of Russiagate. The fact that Trump basically adopted Obama's view against the GOP establishment, against the Democratic establishment, that said Ukraine is not a vital interest to the United States. We should not risk anything, much less war with Russia, in order to care about what happens there. What changed in Washington that we have now gone from, we will never send Patriot missile batteries, we will never send Abrams tanks, we will never send F-16s, to one after the next, sending all of those. Back in March of 2022, at the start of the war, the establishment figure Neil Ferguson wrote an article in Bloomberg that expressed a view that at the time was considered evil, which is basically that the United States only has one goal in Ukraine, which is not to protect the Ukrainian people, the inspiring script, the moralistic narrative, the fairy tale we were fed, just like we were told we were going to Iraq to deliver democracy to the Iraqi people. We were going to war in Libya to bring democracy to the Libyans. We were going to try and take out Bashar al-Assad with the CIA secret war because we wanted to help the Syrian people. We're not in Ukraine to help the Ukrainian people. Neil Ferguson said, after talking to both British and American senior foreign policy officials, that the real reason we're in Ukraine was the opposite. It was to sacrifice Ukraine, to destroy Ukraine, in order to bleed Russia. The country suffering most from this war, really the only country, is Ukraine. Their entire country is being destroyed. Their people are dying in huge numbers. Their buildings are all being blown to bits, at least in the parts where this war is. And the people who are benefiting most is the West. The elites in the West. They have a new war for their arms manufacturers. Pundits get to feel Churchillian and purposeful and strong, writing in favor of this war from a safe distance. But this is what Neil Ferguson said at the very beginning, was the real goal was to sacrifice Ukraine and Ukrainians and not protect them. Quote, So unfortunately, does the U.S. Biden is making it. American officials are divided on how much the lessons from Cold War proxy wars like the Soviet Union's war in Afghanistan can be applied to the ongoing war in Ukraine, David Sanger reported for the New York Times on Saturday. According to Sanger, who cannot have written his piece without high-level sources, the Biden administration, quote, seeks to help Ukraine lock Russia in a quagmire without inciting a border conflict with a nuclear-armed adversary or cutting off potential path to de-escalation. CIA officers are helping to ensure that crates of weapons are delivered into the hands of vetted Ukrainian military units, according to American officials. Reading this carefully, I conclude that the U.S. intends to keep this war going. The administration will continue to supply the Ukrainians with anti-aircraft Stingers, anti-tank Javelins, and explosive Switchblade drones. It will keep trying to persuade other NATO governments to supply heavier defensive weaponry. The latest U.S. proposal is for Turkey to provide Ukraine with the sophisticated S-400 anti-aircraft system, with Ankara purchased from Moscow just a few years ago. I expect it to go the way of the scuttled plan for Polish MiG fighters. Washington will revert to the Afghanistan after 1979 playbook of supplying an insurgency only if the Ukrainian government loses the conventional war. I have evidence from other sources to corroborate this. Quote, the only end game now, a senior administration official was heard to say at a private event earlier this month, is the end of Putin's regime. Until then, all the time Putin stays, Russia will be a pariah state that will never be welcomed back into the community of nations. I gather that senior British figures are talking in similar terms. There is a belief that, quote, the UK's #1 option is for the conflict to be extended and thereby bleed Putin. Again and again I hear such language. It helped explain, among other things, the lack of diplomatic effort by the U.S. to secure a ceasefire. It also explains the readiness of President Joe Biden to call Putin a war criminal. And that indeed is exactly what ended up happening. The reality is the only identifiable U.S. interest was achieved in the first month of the war, which was when the U.S. coerced Germany and then Europe to cut off the Nord Stream 2 pipeline and to start buying natural gas from the United States. Everything else after that has been trying to do to Ukraine what the United States did to Syria, leave it in ruins by bleeding out the war just long enough in order to weaken Russia. That is what everything is about, why we're sending $100 billion in weapons there, depleting our own stockpiles, and most dangerously of all, increasingly risking all sorts of new escalations. Now, we have for you the articles that show how Biden would 1 month declare he refuses to send the weapon system I mentioned, and then months later send the rest. As I told you, the last week brought the worst reversal of all, the most severe, and by no means necessarily the last one, where we're now giving them fighter jets, F-16 fighter jets. And of course, the Ukrainians are supposedly promising not to use it to strike deep in Russia. They've repeatedly violated those promises in other ways, using American weapons to strike Russian targets inside Russia. And there are few greater escalatory dangers than that. And as always, the question becomes, who is benefiting from this war? It is definitely not you, as American infrastructure crumbles. But the CIA is benefiting. Arms manufacturers in the West are definitely benefiting. And it's hard to tell who else beyond that. But what is for sure true is that the core doctrine of Washington, of bipartisan foreign policy in Washington, has radically changed, seemingly overnight, when it comes to the question of Ukraine. And the only real explanation I can find is that the Democratic Party fed for so long an anti-Russian animus as a result of Russiagate. They really became convinced that what they regard as the greatest and most cataclysmic event in recent U.S. history, the election of Donald Trump in 2016 and the defeat of Hillary Clinton, was due to interference by Moscow. And this is payback for that. We seem to be willing to risk blowing ourselves up over the question of who rules provinces in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass, where the people of that region have always clearly had greater loyalty to Moscow than to Kiev. And whatever the motive is, ultimately, and ultimately it was very hard to tell the motive. In Iraq, people had different motives for why we invaded that country and occupied it for over a decade. You can see what escalation is unfolding right before your eyes. Never with congressional debate, let alone debate of the American people. In fact, the Republican Party before the midterms, Kevin McCarthy, trying to win the speakership position in the midterm, sent signals that he would impose limits on the flow of money from the United States to Ukraine, logged the most corrupt country in Europe. And as soon as he won, and the Republicans won that election, and he got to be the speaker, all of that stopped, and he's now aligned with the biggest hawks and warmongers in the Republican Party, saying, I've always been on the side of Biden when it comes to the war in Ukraine, and I always will be. We stand with Ukraine until the very end. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update. Catch our full shows for free, live weekdays at 7 p.m. Eastern on Rumble, and join our locals community at greenwald.locals.com for all of my written journalism, exclusive after-show Q&As, and more.